All right, let's go. Number 13, the Viking comb. In the graves of the Norse world, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the islands of the North Atlantic, one object turns up more reliably than almost any other. Not the sword, not the shield, the comb. It is there with the rich jarl, and there with the poor farmer laid beside the body, as if a person could not be sent into the next world without one. Most were made not from wood or horn, but from antler cut from red deer, or in the far north from reindeer, then split into thin plates and riveted together into a single composite tool, its teeth cut fine along one edge. A good one took days of skilled work and was often kept in its own protective case so the teeth would not snap. The archaeology of these combs was transformed by a method that has nothing to do with shape or style. At the University of York, Stephen Ashby and colleagues drew on a technique called zooms developed in the laboratory of Matthew Collins, which reads the collagen in a fragment of bone or antler and identifies the animal it came from. When they applied it to combs from the trading towns of the Viking Age, something in the raw material stood out. At Hedeby in the south, and at Ribe in Denmark, and in the northern Isles of Scotland, many of the combs were made from reindeer antler. There are no reindeer in Denmark. There are none in Orkney. The antler had to have come down from Norway, carried south by travelers, before the towns that used it had any reindeer of their own. That single fact reaches further than a grooming tool has any right to. It means the routes were open early, that people were moving antler and other goods across the northern seas, well before the raids that made the Norse famous. Ashby has suggested that the seafaring skill built up on those quiet trading runs may be part of what later carried longships to the coasts of England. The comb was not just a comb. It was a receipt for a journey. The care itself meant something. The sagas treat hair as a mark of a free person groomed and worn long, while a slave's head was cropped. The Arab envoy Ibn Fadlan, watching the Rus on the Volga in the 10th century, noted that they combed their hair every day, and then in the same account called them the filthiest of God's creatures for sharing their washing water. The picture that survives is neither clean nor dirty, but particular. These were people who took the comb seriously enough to carry it on the belt beside the knife and to keep it within reach in the grave. For the poorest, a comb might be plain wood. For the powerful, it could be carved from walrus ivory, the same northern luxury the Norse would later ship the length of Europe. The form is so consistent and shifted so steadily over the centuries that archaeologists use these combs to date the layers they come from and to trace where their makers had traveled. When combcraft faded in England around the time of the Norman conquest, it was partly because new forest laws made antler harder to obtain, and partly because a showy piece of grooming kit had simply gone out of fashion. The tool remains. The hair it was made for is long gone, and the reindeer antler in it still points silently back across a sea toward the north it came from. Number 12. The gel that outlived the embalmers. At the KNIH Center for Biomedical Egyptology at the University of Manchester, the archaeological scientist Natalie McCreish set out to study something most excavations pass over. Not the resins, not the wrappings, but the hair itself. With Rosalie David and colleagues, she examined samples from 18 Egyptian mummies, most of them from a cemetery in the Dakhla Oasis in the Western Desert, dating to Greco-Roman times, around 2,300 years ago, with the oldest closer to 3,500 years old. The people ranged in age from 4 to 58. Some had been deliberately embalmed. Others had simply dried in the desert sand. Under the microscope, 9 of them shared a strange feature. Each strand of hair was coated in a fatty film. Gas chromatography broke the coating down into its molecules, and what came back were long-chain fatty acids, palmitic, and steric, the signature of a fat or oil rather than any embalming compound. That distinction is the whole story. The coating was not the resin used to preserve the body. It was something applied only to the hair, worked in strand by strand, to hold a style in place. In modern terms, it was a fixative. It was hair gel. The detail that changes the meaning is where the gel appears. It is on the bodies that were carefully embalmed, And it is also on the bodies that were never embalmed at all, the ones the sand alone preserved. A funerary treatment would show up only on the prepared dead. This showed up on people who had never been prepared for anything, which means the product was worn in life in front of a mirror of polished bronze on ordinary mornings. Curls were the fashion, long and short alike, and metal rods that look like curling tongs have been found in Egyptian tombs. The fat held the curl. It was not beeswax, which would have been almost impossible to wash out, but a softer fat, most likely animal, that could be worked in and later rinsed away. Tomb paintings show Egyptians at banquets, with pale cones set on their heads, long understood as scented fat, meant to melt down through the hair as the evening wore. On another version of the same instinct to dress the hair with grease and perfume. The styles themselves varied with age and sex and standing, some cropped close, some elaborately curled, but the fat runs through nearly all of them as the shared technology of holding a shape in place. There is a quiet consequence buried in the embalmer's own behavior. In the cases where the hair had been styled, the mummification was adjusted so as not to disturb it. The people preparing the body worked around the hairstyle, preserving the arrangement the living person had chosen. Vanity, in other words, was carried across the line into death on purpose. Lachish put it plainly that you can almost picture them alive tending their hair and setting the curls. The evidence for that picture is not a painting or a text. It is the fat itself still lying along each strand, holding a 2,000-year-old style in a shape its owner would recognize. Number 11. The tool that never changed. Take a fine-toothed comb of the ancient world in your hand, and you are holding a design that has not moved in more than 3,000 years. 2 rows of teeth, one coarse and one fine, cut into a flat back, often from imported boxwood, chosen because it is hard enough to carry teeth crowded close together. The coarse side untangles. The fine side does the real work, dragged slowly along the hair, so that its narrow gaps rake out what a wider comb leaves behind. It is almost unchanged, the same object sold today in a pharmacy for the same purpose. For a long time, it was assumed these combs were simply for grooming. That assumption broke in the late 1980s when the anthropologist Joseph Zies and the parasitologist Costa Mumkuoglu examined a comb from the Roman period, roughly 2,000 years old, that had come out of the Judean desert. Lodged in the fine teeth where the wood had protected them from the air were 10 head lice and 27 eggs. Their interest, as they later wrote, was aroused. They began pulling other combs from the collections and looking closely between the teeth. Of the combs they examined from the desert, the majority carried the same cargo lice, or their cemented eggs, or both. On one comb, they counted more than 80 eggs. Mumkuoglu, over the following years, went through around 50 ancient combs, ranging from 500 to 2,500 years old, and found lice, or nits, on roughly half of them. The pattern runs far past the desert and far past Rome. 9,000-year-old louse eggs cling to hair from a cave near the Dead Sea. A double-sided comb raised from the wreck of an English warship, the Mary Rose, which sank in 1545, still holds nits lodged between its teeth. Lice were familiar enough to the ancient Near East that they appear in the Book of Exodus as the third of the plagues sent down on Egypt. The comb was an answer to a problem that no century and no class ever quite escaped. The combs came from places that were not slums. They came from Masada, from Qumran, from Moa, a way station on the incense route between Petra and Gaza, and from fortified stops along the Roman roads. The boxwood many were cut from does not grow in the region and had to be brought in from the north, which means real effort and expense went into making them. People invested in these tools because the problem was constant and it reached everyone. The lice themselves have since become evidence in their own right. Ancient DNA drawn from Roman period specimens on combs from the Judean desert has been sorted into distinct genetic lineages, the same lineages used to trace how human populations moved and split across the world. The parasite in the teeth of the comb carries a map of its host's ancestry. What the comb's record in the end is not filth, but attention. Someone sat with this object day after day, working it through a child's hair. The wood kept the evidence. The eggs are still there, between the teeth. Small, pale ovals, cemented to the base of hairs that stopped growing 2,000 years ago, in a tool whose shape has not changed, because the thing it fights has not changed either. Number 10. The fair-haired dead of the Taklamakan. In the sand of the Tarim Basin, in what is now the far west of China, the dead do not rot. The desert is dry enough and salted enough that bodies laid there in the Bronze Age dried whole, keeping their skin, their clothing, and their hair. The most famous of them is a woman from the Xiaohe Cemetery, sometimes called the Beauty of Xiaohe, who lies in a boat-shaped coffin under a hide cover. She still has her eyelashes. She wears a felt hat and a woven wool cloak and fur-lined boots. And her hair, framing a face that looks almost asleep, is light brown fair against the dark leather around her. That hair set off a century of argument. When European explorers first found these mummies in the early 20th century, the fair hair and tall bodies and Western-looking clothing suggested an obvious story. Travelers from the West wandered impossibly far east, buried at the edge of the desert. For decades, the mummies were treated as evidence of a lost migration out of Europe or the steppe. Then, in 2021, a team including Chungwon Jong Yinkyu and Christina Werner read the genomes of 13 of the oldest Tarim individuals, dating from roughly 2100 to 1600 BC, and published the result in Nature. The story the hair implied was wrong. They were not migrants from anywhere. Genetically, they were a local people with astonishingly deep roots, direct descendants of a population called the ancient North Eurasians, Ice Age hunter-gatherers who had once ranged across northern Eurasia and had largely vanished by the end of the last glacial period. The Tarim group carried that ancestry, almost undiluted, with no sign of the Western herders they had been assumed to be, and no admixture with their Bronze Age neighbors at all. They were a genetic island, isolated for thousands of years, that had simply borrowed farming and herding and weaving from the peoples around them, while marrying only among themselves. An earlier look at their maternal DNA in the mid-2010s had turned up a confusing mix of Eastern and Western lineages enough to keep the migration idea alive a while longer. The 2021 study sampled the oldest burials and read across the whole genome, which is why its answer carries more weight. It also underlined how strange their isolation was, the mark of a population squeezed through a long and narrow bottleneck before it ever reached the basin. What they took from the peoples around them was practical, not genetic wheat and millet herds. The wool and felt they wore, even lumps of cheese laid on the chests of the dead. The language question stays open. Centuries later, the region would speak Tocharian, an Indo-European tongue, but the researchers are careful to say their data cannot tell us whether these Bronze Age people spoke anything like it. Genes and clothing and words had each run on their own separate schedule. The fair hair, in other words, was not a passport from the West. It belonged to a group so old and so separate that they are among the closest living links we have to a Pleistocene world that otherwise survives only as fractions in other people's genomes highest today among some populations of Siberia and the Americas. Their felt hats and wool were adopted. Their faces were their own. She lies now in a museum in Xinjiang, eyelashes intact, the fair hair still in place. For 100 years, that hair told strangers a story about where she came from. Her genome tells a stranger one. She came from there and had for longer than almost anyone around her. Number 9. The louse that remembers a gorilla. For most parasites, the rule is simple. They ride a lineage down through time, splitting when their hosts split, so that the family tree of the parasite mirrors the family tree of the animal it lives on. Human head lice obey this rule. They share a common ancestor with the lice of chimpanzees, and the two diverged around 6 million years ago at about the same moment. Our ancestors and the ancestors of chimps went their separate ways. The louse tracks the host. That is how it is supposed to work. It is a strong enough pattern that the lice of many animals can be read almost like a second copy of the family tree. Splitting where their hosts split tracing lineages, the bones alone leave vague. Then there is the other louse. Humans are unusual among primates in carrying two entirely different kinds. One is the head and body louse, pediculus. The other is the pubic louse, pethyrus, the one that lives in coarse body hair. And when David Reed and colleagues at the University of Florida compared its DNA to the lice of other apes in 2007, the result did not fit the tidy rule at all. The closest relative of the human pubic louse is not found on chimpanzees, our nearest kin. It is found on gorillas. And the two split not deep in the primate past, but around 3.5 million years ago, long after the human and gorilla lineages had already separated some 7 million years back. The arithmetic leaves only one conclusion. This louse did not descend to us from a shared ancestor. It crossed over from gorillas to early humans at a specific and much later moment. A parasite jumped species, and to do that, the two species had to be in close and repeated contact. Reed was careful about what that contact was, because the obvious guess is the wrong instinct. The transfer did not require anything intimate. Lice move between hosts through shared space and shared bodies of a much more ordinary kind, sleeping in an abandoned nest, or more likely butchering and scavenging the animal itself. Early hominins who cut up gorilla carcasses or slept where gorillas had slept would have picked up the passengers without ceremony. Reed's larger point was that parasites can do what bones often cannot. The human fossil record for these deep stretches is thin, and ancient DNA from millions of years ago is essentially unrecoverable. But lice and other parasites have ridden alongside us the whole way, keeping a parallel record in their own genomes. That a predator picks up the parasites of its prey is ordinary biology seen again and again across the animal world. The unusual thing is that humans came out of this history carrying two separate lice at once. The head louse inherited from a shared ancestor with chimps, and the pubic louse acquired later from gorillas. The pubic louse settled where it did in coarse body hair, possibly because that was the one niche left open once our ancestors had shed most of their fur, and the rest of the body no longer offered a home. What survives from that encounter is nothing you could dig up. There is no bone, no tool, no camp, no fossil. Of the meeting, the gorilla fossil record for that stretch of time is nearly blank. The only record that our ancestors and gorillas were sharing the same ground 3.5 million years ago is written in the DNA of an insect that still lives on the human body. The event left no ruin. It left a louse. Number 8. Clonycavan Man. In March 2003, a peat harvesting machine in a bog at Clonycavan in County Meath, Ireland, cut through something it was not built to cut. The lower half of a human body was torn away in the process. What remained the torso and head was so well preserved by the acid and cold of the bog that the man's features were still legible more than 2,000 years after his death. He had a squashed nose and crooked teeth and a thin beard, and on top of his head standing up was a hairstyle. His fine hair had been swept up from the front and gathered into a raised bundle on the crown held in place, and a fragment of a hair tie was found with the body. He was a small man, around 5 feet 2 inches. Radiocarbon dating placed his death between 392 and 201 BC in the Iron Age. The raised hair researchers suggested may have been a way to add height he did not have. What held it up is the part that travels. The styling substance was analyzed by Stephen Buckley at the University of York and found to be a mixture of plant oil and pine resin. The resin did not come from any pine that grows in Ireland. It came from a species native to southwestern France or northern Spain. That places a working trade route running up the Atlantic seaboard of Europe centuries before Rome carried its own goods and roads into Iberia, a connection visible not in a treaty or a coin, but in the grease on a single man's hair. That is a distance of well over 1,000 miles, crossed before Rome had reached that part of the world. A short man in an Irish bog was styling his hair with a product whose ingredients had traveled up the Atlantic coast of Europe. The gel was not vanity alone. It was a thread of long-distance trade, worn on the head of a single person, and it marked him as someone with the wealth to buy imported goods. His hair recorded more than fashion. Chemical traces in it read by researchers at the National Museum of Ireland pointed to a diet rich in plant food and suggested he died in summer or early autumn when such food was fresh. The manner of his death was not gentle. His skull had been split by heavy blows, and his body carried the marks of a deliberate ritual killing of a kind seen in other Irish bog bodies. Eamon Kelly, then keeper of Irish antiquities at the museum, has argued that these were sacrificial victims offered in connection with kingship and the sovereignty of the land. He was not alone in the ground. A second bog body, Old Krogan Man, found the same year, not far away, was a giant of a man over 6.5 feet tall, with manicured nails and hands that had done no hard labor, tortured and then beheaded. In Kelly's reading, the mutilations on these bodies were not random cruelty, but a kind of grammar of failed or rejected kingship. Old Krogan Man's nipples had been cut, and in early Irish tradition, the sucking of a king's nipples was a gesture of submission. So to sever them was to declare that this man would never be, or never again be, a king. He is on display now in Dublin, in a case his hair still swept up on his head. The style has held for more than 2 millennia. The resin that held it came from the far side of a sea, carried to a man who was killed and pushed down into a bog, and whose last act of self-regard is the thing about him that survives most clearly. Number 7. The glue that kept a genome. Anyone who has ever tried to pick a knit off a strand of hair knows how well it holds. The female louse does not simply rest her egg against the hair. She cements it, gluing the base of the egg to the shaft with a hard sheath of her own making close to the scalp, where the warmth of the skin will keep it alive. That glue is one of the more durable things a body produces. Louse eggs have been found still fixed to human hair after 10,000 years. They have turned up in the guts of mummies from Greenland, whose bodies carried infestations so heavy that whole lice worked their way inside and on a woman from Lulan in the Tarim desert, nearly 4,000 years old. The innite is one of the most persistent traces a human life leaves behind. In 2021, a team led by Alejandra Perotti at the University of Reading, working with Mikkel Winther Pedersen and others, asked a question about that glue that no one had asked. As the louse spreads her cement over the hair, she is working directly against the scalp, and the scalp is shedding skin cells. What if some of those cells were caught in the glue as it set? They looked at knits on the hair of mummies from the Ansilta culture of the Andes of San Juan in western Argentina, remains around 1,500 to 2,000 years old. Using a dye that binds to DNA and careful imaging, they found what they had suspected. Sealed inside the cement, trapped as the glue hardened, were the nuclei of human skin cells. They drew the DNA out. The yield was not marginal. The genetic material recovered from the NIT cement was of higher quality than what is often pulled from the more usual sources, comparable to the amount held in a tooth more than a skull bone, gives up several times more than the blood inside the louse itself. From the glue of a parasite, they reconstructed information about the human it had lived on. The DNA showed that these highland people carried ancestry from the rainforests to the east in what is now Venezuela and Colombia. A migration into the mountains, written into the cells, caught in a louse's cement. The same team looked at knits from other remains too, from human hair woven into a textile in Chile, and from a shrunken head made by the Jivaroan people of the Ecuadorian Amazon. Each carried the potential to speak. The value of the method is not only its novelty. Drawing DNA from a skull or a tooth means damaging a rare specimen, and for many fragile remains, no bone can be spared at all. But a few hairs bearing knits can be taken without harming the body. Head lice have shadowed humans through the whole of our existence, so wherever hair survives, there may be a hidden archive of the person it grew on. The knits gave up more than ancestry. The cement had been laid down unusually close to the scalp, and lice lay their eggs nearer the skin when they need more warmth in cold conditions. The position of the eggs indicated that these people had been exposed to extreme cold around the time they died. High in the mountains, a detail of their last days preserved in the spacing of parasite eggs on a hair. It is the reverse of the old idea of the insect trapped in amber carrying the blood of the creature it fed on. Here the insect is not preserved. What it preserved is us. A single hair, with a knit still gripping it, holds two lives at once, the louse and its host, and in the fine gap between egg and scalp, the memory of a cold that came before the end. Number 6. The arsenic in the Iceman's hair. When a body melted out of the ice in the Ötztal Alps in 1991 on the border between Italy and Austria, it turned out to be more than 5,000 years old, a man who had died around 3300 BC and been sealed in glacial ice ever since. He is called Ötzi. Almost everything about him survived down to the contents of his stomach and a copper-bladed axe of nearly pure metal, a valuable and advanced possession for his time. Around him were the tools of a life lived outdoors, a long bow of yew, a flint dagger, a quiver of arrows, birch bark, containers, and the axe. He carried whipworm in his gut and wore dozens of small tattoos, many of them placed over points the body finds sore, which some read as an early attempt to treat aching joints. He had not died of age or of cold. An arrowhead was lodged in his shoulder. He had been killed. Only a few strands of his hair came through. Those strands were analyzed, and they held something unexpected. The hair carried very high levels of two elements, copper and arsenic. In modern terms, the arsenic reading was extreme, dozens of times higher than what turns up in people not exposed to it. One analysis put it at around 40 micrograms of arsenic in every gram of hair, where an unexposed person today measures a small fraction of a single microgram. The early interpretation published by Don Brothwell and Jeffrey Grime was direct and compelling. Smelting copper releases arsenic as a byproduct. A man whose hair was loaded with both copper and arsenic had probably stood over the fires himself, breathing the smoke working the metal. It seemed to make him a metal worker, one of the specialists who handled the new and difficult craft of the Copper Age. Then the reading grew complicated. Grime himself later raised the possibility that the copper was sitting on the outside of the hair rather than inside it, deposited after death by bacteria that concentrate metal in ground that carries copper. A moss that grows preferentially on copper-bearing rock was present in the area. The copper, in other words, might be a stain from the mountain, not a trace of his trade. The picture shifted again in 2016. The geochemist Wolfgang Müller, who had already used isotopes in the Iceman's tissues to trace his origins to a valley in the south. Tyrrell re-examined the heavy metals in his hairnails and organs. The conclusion was that Ötzi was probably not a metal worker after all, and the copper in his own axe, when its source was traced, came not from the nearby Alps, but from ore mined far to the south in Tuscany. The same isotope work had already placed the man himself in the valleys of the South Tyrol, close to where he died. So his body and his axe had different origins, one local and one carried across the mountains. So the axe traveled, and the knowledge to make it traveled, but the man carrying it may not have made it. The disagreement is less a failure than a warning about hair itself. A strand records what touches it in life, but it goes on taking in from its surroundings, long after death, from ice and soil, and the metals in the ground. So the line between a signal from a life and a stain from a grave can be very hard to draw. The hair posed a question about who he was, and then declined to answer it cleanly. A few surviving strands, more than 5,000 years old, still hold arsenic at levels that would alarm a modern doctor, and still cannot settle whether that arsenic came from the work of his hands or from the mountain that kept him. Number 5. The cocaine mummies. In 1992, at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Ulm, Germany, the toxicologist Svetla Balabanova ran a routine kind of test on an unusual subject. She used the same methods she used to detect drugs in the recently dead applied to the hair and tissue of ancient Egyptian mummies held in a Munich collection, among them a priestess named Henut Taui, who had lived around 3,000 years ago. The results were not what she expected. The samples tested positive for nicotine, for hashish, and for cocaine. She was not the first to run into the puzzle. Years earlier, examination of the mummy of Ramesses II had reportedly turned up fragments of tobacco, another American plant, a result usually set aside as later contamination. Balabanova's work put the question back on the table and gave it a harder edge, because her method was the standard forensic screen used to convict the living. Two of those are less strange than they sound. Cannabis was known in the ancient Old World, and nicotine is present in a number of Old World plants, so traces of either need not point anywhere exotic. Nicotine in small amounts is produced by several plants of the nightshade family that did grow in the Old World, and henbane and mandrake were both known to ancient medicine. Cannabis had been used across Asia and the Near East for thousands of years. Cocaine is the problem. Cocaine comes from the coca plant, and coca grew only in the Americas on the other side of an ocean that no one is supposed to have crossed until thousands of years after Hinnotawi was buried. Balabanova, doubting her own result, repeated the tests and sent samples to 3 other laboratories. The positive readings came back. She published and was accused of contamination of error of fraud. The mummies themselves were checked and found to be authentically ancient Egyptian, confirmed by the curator of the Munich collection, and later reviewed by the Egyptologist Rosalie David of Manchester, who had assumed the whole thing must be a mistake and went looking for the flaw. The flaw has never been cleanly found, and neither has the proof. This is where the story has to be held carefully rather than pushed. Later attempts to reproduce the finding in other Egyptian remains have been inconsistent. Some detecting nicotine and not cocaine, some detecting nothing. That inconsistency is itself telling. A real and widespread practice ought to leave a repeatable signal, and this signal refuses to repeat, which points as much toward a problem in the samples, or the testing, as toward a lost trade. Contamination of the samples at some point after excavation in collections handled for over a century remains a live and ordinary explanation. Mainstream scholarship does not accept that ancient Egypt was trading across the Atlantic, and the single anomalous molecule is nowhere near enough to carry that weight. The safer conclusion is the dull one. Something in these particular readings behaved like cocaine on genuine mummies, tested with care, and the likeliest culprit is contamination. Somewhere in a century of handling rather than a fleet of ships crossing the Atlantic in the Bronze Age. What remains is a narrow, stubborn fact that will not fully resolve in either direction. The tests were run by a professional using standard methods more than once in more than one laboratory on bodies that are unquestionably ancient. The result should not be there, and no one has produced the contamination that would explain it away, and no one has produced the trade route that would make it real. Whatever put cocaine in that reading, the hair was tested, and the question it raised has never been closed. Number 4. The passenger in the seam. In the summer of 1812, roughly 500,000 soldiers marched into Russia under Napoleon. A few months later, only a fraction staggered back, ruined by cold hunger and something smaller than all of it. In 2001, construction work in Vilnius in Lithuania, along the line of that retreat, uncovered a mass grave holding thousands of the dead. Among the bones and the shreds of uniform forensic examination, recovered the fragments of body lice. The body louse is not the head louse. It lives not on the skin, but in clothing, in the seams of a shirt, worn for weeks without washing, exactly the conditions of an army in retreat. Cold drives people to pile on clothing and stop washing, and the louse thrives in the warmth and neglect of the layers. So an army freezing to death is also an army breeding the very thing that will infect it, and it carries disease. In 2006, a team led by Didier Raoult examined the Vilnius remains and found in the lice from the grave soil and in the dental pulp of the soldiers the DNA of Bartonella quintana, the agent of trench fever, and Rickettsia prowazekii, the agent of epidemic typhus. Around a third of the tested soldiers showed evidence of one or the other. Louse-borne disease, it seemed, had helped destroy the Grande Armée as surely as the winter. The scale of that destruction is hard to hold in the mind. Roughly 500,000 men had crossed into Russia in June. By the depths of the retreat, only tens of thousands were still moving. And of the 25,000 who reached Vilnius that winter, a few thousand lived to leave it. The rest went into pits, like the one the builders opened in 2001. The evidence has since been reopened, which is how this kind of science works. In 2025, a team led by Nicholas Raskovan reanalyzed teeth from the same grave with newer methods that read far more of the genome. They did not find the typhus and trench fever the earlier study had reported, and they noted that the older result rested on very short fragments of DNA that could not be certain. What they did find were different killers still spread in the same conditions, the pathogen of paratyphoid fever and Borrelia recurrentis, the cause of louse-borne relapsing fever. The exact names are being revised. What is not in doubt is that disease riding on lice moved through that army in the snow, and it is not a modern affliction. Trench fever is named for the trenches of the First World War, where it sickened soldiers by the hundreds of thousands, but its bacterium is far older than that. Bartonella quintana has been recovered from human remains 4,000 years old, and from Roman-era skeletons, and from graves across Europe spanning most of 2,000 years. The disease does not even need a bite in the ordinary sense. The louse takes blood and leaves infected waste on the skin, and the host works it into the small wounds of scratching. Trench fever earned its name in the mud of the First World War, where it disabled soldiers in their hundreds of thousands. But the bacterium had already been living in human blood for millennia, waiting only for the crowding and the dirt and the unwashed cloth that war reliably provides. The louse in the seam has been carrying this cargo through human history the entire time. The tool against it is the fine-toothed comb and the washed shirt, and the enemy is a thing the length of a grain of rice. In a mass grave in Lithuania, in bone 4,000 years old, the same DNA keeps turning up the record of a passenger that has ridden in human clothing for as long as humans have worn it and killed armies from inside the seam. Number 3. The girl on the summit. Near the top of Vulcan Lula-Ilaco, a mountain of more than 6,700 meters on the border of Argentina and Chile, 3 children were left in a shrine to die of the cold 500 years ago in the time of the Inca. In 1999, a team led by the mountaineer and archaeologist Johann Reinhard found them so deeply frozen and so high that they had barely changed. The oldest is a girl of around 13, known as the Maiden. She was found seated cross-legged, her head bowed forward, her elaborate headdress still in place, and the objects around her undisturbed. A wad of coca leaves was still in her mouth. They had been placed there as part of a ritual the Inca called capacocha, a state ceremony carried out at moments of importance to the empire in which chosen children were taken to sacred high places and given to the mountain. For most human remains, the record of a life ends with the bones. Hair is different. Hair grows at a steady rate close to a centimeter a month, and it locks into each new segment a chemical trace of what the body was taking in at the time. The maiden's hair was long and tightly braided. It held more than 2 years of her life in order like a tape. 2 other children lay near her, a boy of about 7 and a girl of about 6. The younger of the 2 struck by lightning at some point after her death, which is why she is called the Lightning Girl. Their hair was shorter and told less, but it carried the same substances at lower levels, as though they were attendants to the older girl rather than her equals. Andrew Wilson at the University of Bradford read that tape. An earlier study of the carbon and nitrogen in her hair had already shown a sharp change, roughly a year before her death, when her diet shifted from the potatoes of a peasant child to more maize and animal protein, the food of someone whose status had risen. Then, in work published in 2013, the team read the markers of coca and of alcohol along the length of the braid month by month toward the end. The pattern is precise and hard to look at. Her consumption of coca climbed sharply about 12 months before she died. Her intake of alcohol in the form of the maize beer called chicha rose to a first peak around 6 months out, then surged in her final weeks. Both were controlled substances, not part of an ordinary child's life. In the last stretch of the record, the 2 are being taken together and heavily. The braiding of her hair into its final careful arrangement belongs to those last days. The markers are exact because the body leaves them behind faithfully. Coca chewing shows up in the hair as cocaine and its breakdown product, and when alcohol and coca are taken together, the body forms a third compound that appears only in that combination. So the record can separate drink from leaf and catch the very moment the two were used side by side. That moment for the maiden was the end. Read together the evidence describes a year of preparation ending in a drugged child carried to the top of a freezing mountain. The coca and the chicha would have dulled. Her made her compliant, and in the case of the alcohol, weakened the shivering that fights off the cold. Capacocha was not only a religious act, it was a political one staged by the empire on its most sacred heights, and historians have suggested it was meant in part to bind and to frighten the peoples the Inca had recently conquered. To be chosen was described in the surviving Spanish accounts as an honor. Wilson resisted the distance that usually protects us from such things. This is not a skeleton, he said in effect. This is a person. This is a child. And the data points to something poignant about her last months. She is still seated where the cold kept her in a museum in Salta now, rather than on the peak, the headdress intact, the coca still in her mouth. In the segments of her braid lies a calendar no one meant to leave, counting down from the day her status changed to the day she was placed on the summit, written in the chemistry of a child's own hair. Number 2. The louse that dated the first clothes. Consider the most ordinary parasite imaginable, the body louse, the insect that lives in the folds of unwashed clothing and crawls to the skin to feed. It is so unremarkable that it is easy to miss what it requires. The body louse cannot survive on a bare human body. Its whole way of life, laying its eggs in fabric, sheltering in seams, depends on the existence of clothing. Where there are no clothes, there are no body lice. The insect is so specialized that its body and its whole life cycle are shaped around fabric. It grips cloth rather than hair and comes to the skin only to feed, which is why it is often called the clothing louse. It could not have existed before there was clothing to live in, and it has never been found on a naked host. That single dependency turns the insect into a clock. The body louse evolved from the head louse, splitting off to occupy the new habitat that clothing created. So, the moment those two lice diverged is more or less the moment humans began wearing clothes regularly enough to house a parasite. And a genetic divergence can be dated, even when the thing that caused it has rotted away to nothing. This matters because clothing is close to invisible in the deep record. Stone tools survive by the million, but the skins and plant fibers of the first garments decay within years. So, archaeology can point to scrapers and bone needles and guess at their use, yet it cannot show the coat itself. The louse offers a way in that leaves the archaeology behind, entirely dating the habit by dating the parasite that moved into it. The first attempt came in 2003 from a team including Ralph Kittler and Mark Stoneking at the Max Planck Institute, who compared the DNA of head and body lice and placed their split roughly 70,000 years ago, later revising the figure upward. In 2011, Melissa Toops and David Reed refined the estimate with a broader method and put the divergence at least 83,000 years ago and possibly as far back as 170,000. These are estimates with wide margins, not fixed dates, and the researchers say so plainly. What they agree on is the order of magnitude. Clothing as a regular human habit is tens of thousands of years old at the least, and quite possibly older than our species' first steps out of Africa. There is a further implication folded into the comparison of lineages. Because the clothing louse traces back to modern humans, one reading is that it was modern humans, and not the Neanderthals living through the cold of Ice Age Europe, who developed this kind of tailored clothing, unless the Neanderthals' own lice simply died out with them and left no record to find. Set that against the human body itself. Our ancestors lost most of their body hair around 1 million years ago, long before any clothing, which means humans spent an enormous stretch of time naked and hairless before they thought to cover themselves. The louse marks the end of that stretch. Clothing, the lice suggest, appeared well before humans truly needed it for cold, and then became the thing that made the cold survivable. It was the technology that let a tropical animal walk out of Africa and into the ice of the north. There is something strange in the timing the lice expose. Humans seem to have taken up clothing well before the climate truly forced it, tinkering with cover long before they needed it. And that early habit became the thing that later let them endure latitudes no unclothed primate could survive. A tropical animal talked itself into a coat, and the coat rewrote where that animal could live. No coat that old exists. Skins and fibers from 170,000 years ago decayed without a trace, and the first clothes will never be dug up because there is nothing left of them to find. The only evidence that they were ever made is the parasite that moved in to live in them. The garment is gone. The louse that it created carries the timestamp still measurable in the DNA of an insect crawling in the seam of a shirt, a clock left running on the invention of the first coat. We carry the descendants of that first infestation still. Every case of body lice in the world today traces back along an unbroken line to the moment a human first stayed, dressed long enough to give the parasite a home, which is to say the louse in the seam is not only a clock, but a living inheritance from the day our ancestors stopped being bare. Number 1. The comb from Lachish. It is a small thing, a piece of elephant ivory, a little over 3 centimeters across its teeth, mostly broken away, unearthed in 2016 at Tel Lachish, a mound in the lowlands of what is now Israel that was a major Canaanite city in the Bronze Age. Ivory had to be imported, most likely from Egypt, since there were no elephants in Canaan, which made this comb a luxury the possession of a wealthy household. For 5 years after it came out of the ground, it sat studied, for what it was, a rich person's grooming tool. It was only in late 2021, when Madeline Mumkuoglu turned it under angled light, that the surface gave up what had been hiding on it. Faint scratches resolved into letters. There were 17 of them, tiny 1 to 3 millimeters tall, cut in the earliest form of the alphabet, the Canaanite script from which nearly every later alphabet descends Hebrew and Arabic and Greek and Latin and the letters on this page. The alphabet had been invented only a century or two before, probably by Semitic-speaking workers in Egypt, who adapted a handful of hieroglyphs into signs for sounds, a system simple enough that it needed no trained class of scribes to use it. For a long time, almost nothing written in that early script had been found in the land itself, a word here, a couple of letters there. The comb changed that. The epigrapher, Daniel Vainstub, worked out what they said. Under the direction of Joseph Garfinkel and Michael Hazel, the find was published, and Garfinkel called it a landmark in the history of the human ability to write, because this is not a name scratched on a pot or a single word. It is a full sentence, the earliest complete sentence, yet found in any alphabetic script the ancestor of all the sentences that would follow. The sentence reads, "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard." The first thing a human chose to spell out in the writing system that would carry scripture and law and literature and every word humanity has recorded since was a wish to be rid of lice. And the comb was not speaking in the abstract. When the researchers examined it under the microscope on the second tooth, they found the hardened remains of a head louse, the outer casing of a nymph, 1/2 millimeter long. The plea and the pest were on the same object. The wish had not worked. There is a small human irony folded into that. Ivory was an import and a mark of wealth, and the person who owned this comb was among the well-off of a Bronze Age city, and had lice all the same. The parasite did not respect status, and neither it seems did the wish carve to be rid of it. Its date is not perfectly fixed, and the honest version says so. The comb came from disturbed ground, and its age rests mainly on the shape of its letters, which point to somewhere around 1700 BC, roughly 3,700 years ago. But the meaning does not depend on the exact century. It depends on what the sentence is about. The preservation itself was partial and precise. The heat of the site had destroyed the soft bodies of the lice, leaving only the tough outer casing of a single nymph clinging to one tooth, so that what survives is not a whole insect, but the shell of one caught in the act of being combed out. Look back along this whole list, and the same thread runs through all of it. The Viking antler that recorded a trade route, the Egyptian fat that held a curl into death, the boxwood comb with 80 eggs still in its teeth, the fair hair that hid a genome, the gorilla's louse still writing the human body from 3.5 million years ago. The innate cement that kept a person's DNA in the cold of their last day. The arsenic in the Iceman's strands. The cocaine that will not resolve. The body louse that dated the first coat and carried plague in the seam. The Andean braid counting down a child's final year. In every case, the intimate leftovers of hair, the things caught in it and combed out of it, turned out to be a record of something far larger than a person's appearance, of trade and drugs and migration and disease and ancestry and death. And through all of it moves the louse, the oldest companion our species has. It was on us before we were human, when we scavenged gorillas on the savannah. It was on us when we first pulled on clothing and walked into the ice. It was on the Bronze Age scribe who owned an ivory comb and had lice anyway, and reached for the alphabet and used it for the first full sentence anyone would ever write to ask for relief from the thing between the teeth of his comb. It sits now in Jerusalem, 17 letters and one louse on a sliver of ivory. The oldest sentence we have and the oldest complaint are the same sentence. 3,700 years later, the comb is still here, and so on. The second tooth is the louse. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.